The Lewis and Clark Expedition, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark from 1804 to 1806, a landmark American journey commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson following the Louisiana Purchase. Tasked with exploring the newly acquired territory, the expedition sought to chart the lands west of the Mississippi, establish trade and diplomatic relations with native tribes, and find a practical route to the Pacific Ocean. It was an arduous journey. Took the Corps of Discovery, as the expedition team was known, from St. Louis, Missouri, to the shores of the Pacific Northwest and back, covering more than 8,000 miles. The expedition was pivotal for the gathering of scientific and geographical knowledge, documenting various plant and animal species previously unknown, and creating detailed maps of the vast territory. But key to their success was Sacagawea, a native interpreter, whose knowledge of the terrain and languages proved to be invaluable, particularly in the negotiations with the native tribes. And thus, the Lewis and Clark expedition significantly contributed to the expansion and development of the United States by providing valuable insights into the natural resources and strategic landscapes of the West. Hello and welcome to the channel. So we talk about some American history today, Native American, and the newer American, but it all molds into one great and exciting tapestry, which is very interesting to talk about. I didn't learn too much of it because I was educated in Australia, so it's good to actually familiarize myself with it as we go through all of these stories together. Now, as usual, before we start, if you like the content, just click the like and subscribe button. It's so easy. We're trying to get the goal of, 85,000 subscribers. Hopefully by the time you listen to this, we're there. Anyway, with that in mind and with the customary begging out of the way, let's get nice and relaxed, and we can begin our story back to that early days of the 1800s. So, the Corps of Discovery. You know it as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and we'll refer to it as such. It was conducted between 1804 and 1806. Now, just after the Louisiana Purchase from 1803, which they bought off Napoleon, by the way, needing to finance his wars. But we already know that from the introduction. And we're going to talk a little bit about Thomas Jefferson. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. Well, he had a long-standing fascination with the Western frontier, fueled by his readings on various explorers' journeys, and there were plenty of them, certainly a golden age for exploration. Now, during the 1780s, while serving as minister to France, Jefferson met one John Ledyard in Paris, and they discussed a possible expedition to the Pacific Northwest. Of course, this was very much influenced by the great Captain James Cook's voyage to the Pacific Ocean, and also Lepage du Prat's History of Louisiana. Jefferson developed this desire to explore a route to the Pacific, a kind of wanderlust, this curiosity about the world that was, well, you could only really get it in the 1800s, that age of discovery, where there was still so much left to discover. Well, Alexander Mackenzie's expedition in 1793 in which he became the first non-indigenous person to cross mainland North America north of Mexico, further convinced Jefferson of the need to secure the Western Territory for the U.S., especially to counter the British influence in the lucrative Columbia River fur trade. So, in preparation for the expedition, Israel Whalen, a Philadelphia supplier, procured essential items for the journey based on a list provided by Meriwether Lewis. This included portable soup, pigtail tobacco, spirit of wine, gifts for Native Americans, along with medical supplies, mosquito netting, and oilskin bags. 2 years into his presidency, Jefferson requested Congress to fund an expedition across the newly acquired Louisiana Territory to get to the Pacific. Now, although he made his intentions known to the French, British, and Spanish officials, he did use a covert message to seek funds, and this was mainly due to opposition from the Federalist Party. Well, it worked out well for him. Congress ultimately allocated £2,324 for provision, with Lewis overseeing the procurement. And so, in 1803, Thomas Jefferson commissioned the Corps of Discovery and appointed Army Captain Meriwether Lewis as its head, who then persuaded William Clark to co-lead the expedition. You see, Lewis, he was not new to the game. He had exceptional abilities and was a great frontiersman, while Jefferson endeavored to equip him for the extensive trek as the expedition secured sanction and money. Jefferson spoke about his selection of Lewis as follows. It was impossible to find a character who, to complete a science in botany, natural history, mineralogy, and astronomy, joined the firmness and constitution, and character and prudence, habits adapted to the woods, and a familiarity with the Indian manners and character requisite for this undertaking. All the latter qualifications Captain Lewis has. Stunning review from Jefferson. So, in 1803, Jefferson dispatched Lewis to Philadelphia to investigate medicinal remedies under Benjamin Rush, a physician and former commander of the American Revolution. He also facilitated Lewis's advanced education under one Andrew Ellicott. He was an astronomer, and a damned good one, who taught him the utilization of sextant and other navigational devices. And just remember that a lot of this was new. Around the turn of the 19th century, people were still figuring out a lot of these ways to explore in these far-flung places, dodging diseases and animals and natives and everything else. Of course, it wasn't very good for the natives trying to dodge the people who were exploring them, but, well, it was an interesting situation for everybody, let's just put it that way. Well, Lewis was always keen to learn, so he acquired the knowledge on the description and preservation of plant and animal specimens from one Benjamin Smith Barton. He received advances in calculating latitude and longitude from Robert Patterson, and Caspar Wister provided insights on fossils and the quest for potential living remnants. Lewis, however, was not unacquainted with science, not a newcomer by anyone's standards. You see, he had exhibited a noble aptitude for learning in all areas, particularly under the tutelage of Jefferson. At Monticello, Jefferson maintained an extensive library focused on North American geography to which Lewis was given unrestricted access. He dedicated time to examining maps and literature, in addition to discussing matters with Jefferson in great detail. Now, the keel boat utilized during the inaugural year of the expedition was constructed at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1803, according to the specifications laid out by Lewis, and on August 31st, it was finalized. The ship was promptly filled with supplies and equipment, absolutely everything they could need, perhaps not everything they wanted. Now, during their time in Pittsburgh, Lewis acquired a Newfoundland dog named Seaman to accompany them. Newfoundlands are sociable, sizable working dogs, and proficient swimmers, fond of water, and frequently seen aboard fishing vessels, as they can aid in aquatic rescues. Now, Seaman showed his worth as a crucial member of the expedition, assisting with hunting and safeguarding against bears and other potential threats. He was also the sole animal to accomplish the entire journey. And so, in October 1803, Lewis and his crew embarked in the afternoon, navigating the Ohio River to rendezvous with Clark near Louisville, Kentucky, at the Falls of Ohio. Their objectives were to investigate the extensive land which was just obtained from Napoleon himself in the Louisiana Purchase, and establish commerce and U.S. authority of the Native American populations along the Missouri River. Jefferson aimed to assert a U.S. claim of discovery over the Pacific Northwest and Oregon region by recording an American presence prior to European governments asserting ownership of the land. Now, there are some historians who assert that Jefferson recognized he would own a stronger claim to the Pacific Northwest if the crew collected scientific data on flora and fauna. His primary efforts were focused on discovering a navigable waterway to the Pacific coast and facilitating trade, however. His directives to the expedition specified as follows, and I quote, "The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River, and such a principal stream of it as by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, with the Columbia, Oregon, Colorado, or any other river may differ the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purpose of commerce." Of course, the expedition didn't go empty-handed. They carried advanced weaponry for the time, including an Austrian-made .46 caliber Girandoni air rifle, which had a 20-round magazine and was powerful enough to take down a fully grown deer. They also bought flintlock weapons, knives, blacksmithing tools, mapping instruments, flags, gifts, medicine, other essential supplies for the journey. Now, their route followed the Missouri River to its source, continuing to the Pacific Ocean via the Columbia River, likely inspired by Montcalm Ab's earlier transcontinental journey as describing Lepage's History of Louisiana, a copy of which Lewis had brought with him for reference. Lepage's account had led them to believe that crossing the Rocky Mountains would be simple. Really? It did not have many mention of the difficulties of this terrain. Didn't tell them about all of the rocks that they would encounter. So, all met up, all together, the Corps of Discovery began their official expedition from Camp Dubois, also known as Camp Wood, around 4 p.m. on May 14, 1804. The Corps of Discovery was made up of around 45 individuals, including the officers, the enlisted men, civilian volunteers, and Clark's enslaved man, York. Yeah, had to bring a slave along too, of course. Well, as they traveled up the Missouri River from St. Charles, they passed through what is now Kansas City, Missouri, and Omaha, Nebraska. On August 20th, 1804, Sergeant Charles Floyd passed away. Probably appendicitis. Not a good way to go. Becoming the only member of the expedition to actually die, which is actually rare for expeditions of those types in those times. Now he was buried near a river bluff, which was named Floyd's Bluff in his honor, located in present-day Sioux City, Iowa. His grave was marked with a cedar post bearing his name and date of death, and the group named a nearby river Floyd's River. In the final week of August, the expedition reached the Great Plains, an area rich in wildlife such as elk, deer, bison, beavers, and pronghorn, offering both new experiences and challenges as they continued westward. And they also forged relationships with around 24 Native American nations, whose assistance was crucial to prevent famines during the severe winters and to avoid becoming irrevocably lost in the huge Rocky Mountain ranges. Now, the Americans and the Lakota Nation, referred to by the Americans as Sioux or Teton-Wan Sioux, encountered difficulties upon their meeting, raising concerns about a potential conflict between the two parties. It's been stated by Harry Fritz that all prior travelers to the Missouri River had cautioned about this formidable and assertive tribe, intent on obstructing free trade along the river. The Sioux anticipated a reprisal incursion from the Omaha tribe to the south. A recent Sioux incursion resulted in the deaths of 75 Omaha men, the destruction of 40 lodges, and the capture of 46 prisoners, so they were not to be trifled with at all. The expedition engaged in discussions with the Lakota at the junction of the Missouri and Bad Rivers, known in our time as Fort Pierre, South Dakota. Now, one of their horses actually went missing, and the finger was solely pointed at the Sioux natives. Subsequently, the two parties convened, resulting in a dispute during which the Sioux requested that the men either remain or provide further gifts or tribute prior to being permitted to traverse the country. Now, Clark gave them a pretty bad review, describing them as warlike, and referred to them as vilest miscreants of the savage race. His words, not mine. Well, they nearly engaged in physical conflict multiple times, until the chief of the Lakota, Black Buffalo, convinced Lewis to allocate additional tobacco to the gathered warriors. Lewis acquiesced, permitting the party to go upstream into the Arikara communities. Now, during the winter of 1804 to 05, the expedition constructed Fort Mandan, located near contemporary Washburn, North Dakota. Prior to its departure on April 7, 1805, the expedition dispatched the keelboat to St. Louis, carrying a collection of species, which some of them had never even been observed east of the Mississippi. A leader requested Lewis and Clark to supply a boat for transit through their native territory. The Americans promptly advanced westward upriver and established a winter encampment within the territory of the Mandan people. Now, following the establishment of the expedition's camp, a considerable number of local tribe members visited. with some of them even remaining for the night. For several days, Lewis and Clark convened with the chiefs of the Mandan tribe. They encountered a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau and his young spouse, Sacagawea. And here, of course, we finally encounter the great interpreter. Harmony was achieved between the expedition and the Mandan chiefs through the exchange of a Mandan ceremonial pipe. By April 26, Captain Lewis composed a progress report detailing the expedition's activities and observations of the Native American nations encountered thus far in his work, a statistical view of the Indian nations inhabiting the territory of Louisiana, which delineated the names of various tribes, their geographical locations, trading practices, and which waterways they utilized, among with a few other little bits and pieces. Now, President Jefferson would subsequently submit this report to Congress. So, after this, they traversed the Missouri to its source, crossed the Continental Divide at Lemhi Pass, proceeded north to Travelers Rest, and navigated the Bitter Root Mountains at Lolo Pass. They traversed on foot before continuing by canoe up the Clearwater, Columbia, and Snake Rivers, passing Calilo Falls and contemporary Portland, located at the junction of the Willamette and Columbia Rivers. They also utilized William Robert Broughton's 1792 notes and maps for navigation when arriving at the lower Columbia River. The observation of Mount Hood and other stratovolcanoes verified that the expedition was indeed nearing the Pacific Ocean, and thus nearing their goal. The crew first observed the Pacific Ocean on the 7th of November, 1805, reaching there 2 weeks thereafter. The expedition encountered the onset of its second harsh winter while camping on the northern bank of the Columbia River, in a tempestuous region designated by Clark as Dismal Niche. That's a terrible name for a town, isn't it? Well, insufficient nourishment was also a significant factor, so maybe he was in a bad mood. Now, the elk, the primary sustenance for the group, had withdrawn from their customary habitats into the mountains, and the party was now too impoverished to acquire sufficient provisions from the adjacent tribes. On November 24th, 1805, the majority of the group agreed to relocate their camp to the southern bank of the Columbia River, sort of near present-day Astoria in Oregon. Now, both Sacagawea and the enslaved individual York participated in the voting process. Fort Clatsop, or Clatsop rather, was established on the south bank of the Columbia River, 2 miles upstream on the west bank of the Nettle River, which is today known as the Lewis and Clark River. Well, at least that's how most people call it. They undertook this action not alone for shelter and security, but also to formally assert the American presence in the area, hoisting the American flag high above the fort. That's one way to make a statement. Throughout the winter at Fort Clatsop, Lewis dedicated himself to the process of writing. He wrote numerous pages of his notebooks with significant insights, primarily about botany, due to the prolific vegetation and woodlands that adorned the region of the continent. But the other men, their health began to deteriorate, with numerous individuals afflicted by colds and influenza. Aware that marine fur traders occasionally frequented the lower Columbia River, Lewis and Clark consistently inquired with indigenous Chinooks for trading vessels. they discovered that Captain Samuel Hill had visited early in 1805. A miscommunication led Clark to document the name rather as Haley. Captain Hill, however, returned in 1805 and anchored approximately 10 miles from Fort Clatsop. The Chinook informed Hill about Lewis and Clark. However, no direct interaction occurred. Now, there was also a Russian maritime expedition that was led by the statesman Nikolai Rezanov, which reached the mouth of the Columbia River during the presence of Lewis and Clark. Rezanov and Lewis and Clark were seemingly unaware of each other's existence. Rezanov arrived from present-day Sitka, Alaska, with the objective of founding a Russian agricultural colony to address the chronic food shortages in Russian America. Well, when we say Russian America, we mean Alaska. And he devised plans to relocate the capital of Russian America from Sitka to the lower Columbia River. However, his vessel, Juno, could not navigate the Columbia Bar. Subsequently, he traveled to California, initiating a series of events that ultimately resulted in the establishment of Fort Ross, California. Perhaps a topic for another video. Now, Lewis, back to the main topic, was resolute in his intention to stay at the fort, until April 1st at least, yet he remained eager to depart at the earliest possible moment. By March 22nd, the inclement weather had abated, and the subsequent morning, March 23rd, 1806, the voyage commenced. The Corps commenced their return journey by navigating canoes up the Columbia River, thereafter traversing overland. Prior to his departure, Clark entrusted the Chinook with a letter intended for the next ship captain, who was the same Captain Hill that had been in proximity over the winter. He delivered the letter to Canton and arranged for its forwarding to Thomas Jefferson, who consequently received it prior to the return of Lewis and Clark. The expedition proceeded to Camp Chopunish in Idaho, situated along the north bank of the Clearwater River, where they gathered 65 horses in anticipation of traversing the Bitterroot Mountains, which separate contemporary Idaho from western Montana. Nevertheless, the range remained snow-covered, hindering the expedition's ability to traverse it. On April 11th, as the Corps awaited the snow's abatement, Lewis's dog, Seaman, was abducted by Native Americans. But don't worry, they got him back. Good boy. Well, concerned that similar actions could ensue, Lewis cautioned the chief that any more misconduct or malevolent actions would lead to immediate execution. On July the 3rd, prior to traversing the Continental Divide, the Corps divided into two factions to allow Lewis to investigate the Marias River. Lewis's quartet encountered individuals from the Blackfeet Nation. Throughout the night, the Blackfeet attempted to appropriate their weapons, but during the conflict, the soldiers killed 2 Blackfeet warriors. Lewis, George Drouillard, and the Field brothers traversed over 100 miles in a single day before establishing camp once again. Now, at the same time, Clark had infiltrated the area of the Crow tribe. During that night, half of Clark's horses had vanished. However, they didn't observe any of the Crow warriors. Lewis and Clark remained apart until they arrived at the junction of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers on August 11th. Upon the group's reunion, one of Clark's hunters, Pierre Crozat, erroneously identified Lewis as an elk and discharged his firearm, wounding Lewis in the thigh. I don't know exactly how he could make that mistake, but he did. At least that was the excuse. Well, upon reuniting, the Corps efficiently navigated home across the Missouri River, and they arrived in St. Louis on September the 23rd, 1806, safe and sound. Well, apart from the leg being almost blown off, but hey, you take it in stride. Now, in March 1804, prior to the expedition's commencement in May, the Spanish in New Mexico were informed by General James Wilkinson that the Americans were intruding against land asserted by Spain, and the Spanish did not like that. Following the commencement of the Lewis and Clark voyage in May, the Spanish had dispatched 4 armed contingents, including 52 soldiers, mercenaries, and Native American helpers on August the 1st, 1804, from Santa Fe, New Mexico, under the command of Pedro Vial and Jose Yarvet, with the intention to intercept and detain the entire expedition. They arrived at the Pawnee encampment along the Platte River in central Nebraska and discovered that the expedition had previously been there some days prior. The group then traversed 70 to 80 miles daily, and Vial's attempt to intercept the Lewis and Clark expedition proved to be futile. I wonder if they had known at all that the Spanish were the hounds barking at their backs. And so, when all is said and done, it was a great success. They accomplished the mission. They acquired knowledge of the Northwest geography and created the initial precise maps of the region. In fact, about 140 of them, which is a formidable task. But it wasn't just the maps. The trip recorded natural resources and flora that were previously completely unknown to Euro-Americans, albeit quite known to indigenous populations, but they didn't bother to ask them. Now, Lewis and Clark were the inaugural Americans to traverse the Continental Divide, the first to see Yellowstone, to enter Montana, and to generate an official account of these many places. Their expedition to the Pacific Northwest, accompanied by maps and declarations of sovereignty through medals and flags, constituted the legal measures required to assert ownership of each indigenous nation's territories in accordance with the doctrine of discovery. Throughout the journey, they established communication with over 70 native tribes and documented more than 200 novel plant and animal species. Jefferson instructed the expedition to assert sovereignty and exhibit military prowess to guarantee the subordination of local tribes to the United States, according to the practice of European conquerors in other regions. Subsequent to the voyage, they generated maps which facilitated the continued exploration and colonization of this extensive region for the next years, always being used as a reference. In 1807, Patrick Gass, a soldier in the U.S. Army, released a narrative of the expedition in his own words. He received a promotion to sergeant through the expedition. Paul Allen edited a 2-volume chronicle of the Lewis and Clark expedition, published in 1814 in Philadelphia. However, he omitted the true author, the banker Nicholas Biddle. The comprehensive report was not disclosed to the public until fairly recently, you see. The first authorized edition of the Lewis and Clark Journal is located in the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Library at the University of Montana. Now, a little bit more about the primary objectives mandated by Jefferson. You see, it was all about conducting a reconnaissance to document the locations, military capabilities, activities, and cultures of the diverse Native American tribes residing in the territory just acquired in the broader Northwest. It aimed to convey to the indigenous populations that their territories, whether they liked it or not, were now under the ownership of the United States and their great father in Washington, who had become their ruler. Of course, many of these native tribes extended their support by imparting knowledge of the wilderness and facilitating food acquisition. The team possessed an unmarked leather-bound journals and ink to document these contacts, along with scientific and geological data obtained in their interactions. They received an assortment of presents, too, including medals, ribbons, needles, mirrors, and other items designed to alleviate tensions during negotiations with Native American chiefs that they would meet along the journey. Numerous tribes had amicable interactions with the British and French fur traders during their occasional meetings along the Missouri and Columbia rivers, and generally, the expedition saw a surprisingly minimal amount of violence, except for a few instances. Those poor Blackfoot men who got killed. Well, on September 25th, 1804, there was that heated conflict with the Teton-Sioux tribe, sometimes referred to as the Lakota people, led by chiefs like Black Buffalo and the Partisan. The leaders approached the expedition and demanded tribute for passage across the river. The 7 indigenous tribes of the Lakota people governed an extensive inland territory and anticipated tributes from outsiders seeking to traverse their rivers or cross their territories. It seems pretty fair, doesn't it? It's just a little bridge toll. Well, Harry Fritz states in his work, all prior Missouri River travelers cautioned about this formidable and assertive tribe, intent on obstructing free trade. Well, the Sioux anticipated a reprisal incursion from the Omaha tribe to the south. Communication was, of course, challenging, to say the least, as the sole Sioux language interpreter for the expedition, Pierre Dorion, remained with the other group and was engaged in diplomatic matters with a different tribe. He's never there when you need him. As a result, both chiefs from different tribes received several gifts, that is, the partisan chief and the Sioux chief. Nevertheless, none was content, and they sought additional gifts for their troops and tribe. At that moment, several warriors from the partisan tribe seized their canoe and one of the oars. Lewis asserted his authority, commanding a show of force and displaying arms. Captain Clark wielded his sword and threatened severe retaliation. But, fortunately, prior to the escalation into a violent and bloody conflict, the chief, Black Buffalo, wisely commanded his warriors to withdraw, and everybody went home with their heads still attached to their shoulders. So that's a win-win. Of course, eventually, they successfully negotiated their passage without additional incident, aided by superior gifts and a bottle of whiskey. I wonder if they drank it before the agreement was struck. Well, either way, during the mission, the team studied and documented the customs, lifestyles, and all the little eccentricities of the numerous native tribes that they encountered. According to European standards, the Native American lifestyle was quite severe and unyielding, as observed by the expedition participants. Following several interactions and prolonged camping among the Native American tribes throughout the winter months, they quickly acquired first-hand knowledge of their practices and social structures. One custom that differentiated Native American cultures from Western societies was the practice whereby men could acquire multiple wives. Of course, this was contingent upon their ability to support them, frequently selecting spouses from their immediate familial circle. For example, the men in the Mandan tribe often married their sisters, which, well, it's a bit... Don't want to push my beliefs onto others, but okay. Now, female chastity was not esteemed very highly either. Fathers frequently sold their infant girls to adult men, typically in exchange for horses or mules. In CO countries, women were frequently exchanged for horses and other goods. However, this practice was not observed among the Shoshone nation, which esteemed its women more highly. Now, I am inclined to believe a lot of this, because they didn't tar all of the natives with the same brush. Now, if they had have put everybody into a big basket and said they're all barbarians, they're all terrible when they all need to be civilized, maybe a few eyebrows would be raised, for obvious reasons. But when they talk about each tribe specifically, and say one tribe does this, but the other does not, well, perhaps we can take it as the reality of the situation. Well, they also observed that Native American nations, and numerous ones of them, were perpetually engaged in conflicts with other tribes, particularly the very warlike Sioux tribe, who, despite maintaining a generally friendly relationship with the European fur traders, had audaciously proclaimed and rationalized the near total annihilation of the once quite formidable Cahokia nation. And it wasn't just them either. We're talking the Missouri, Illinois, Kaskaskia, and Peoria tribes who inhabited the regions surrounding the upper Mississippi and Missouri rivers. So war and conquest was not something new to these parts of the world. Just like with any other part of the world, it's a tale as old as time. Now, of course, we have to talk a little bit about Sacagawea, who was a Native American woman who accompanied her husband and, well, owner, if we want to use those sorts of words, since she was purchased, to Saint Charbonneau on a trip to the Pacific Ocean. Now, on February 11, 1805, shortly after her initial interaction with the expedition, Sacagawea entered labor, which was prolonged and excruciating. Thus, the Frenchman Charbonneau proposed administering a potion made from rattlesnake rattle to facilitate her delivery. Louis, of course, possessed the required goods, and shortly after giving the medication, she gave birth to a healthy child named Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Now, on June 16, 1805, upon reaching the Marias River, Sacagawea fell very ill. She found relief by consuming mineral water from the sulphur spring that flowed into the river. Despite her frequent mention in literature, much of what is told about her is, if not outright fictional, it's at least somewhat exaggerated. Many scholars assert that she observed certain geographical aspects, yet she was not the guide for the expedition. But she was significant to them as an interpreter and in other capacities, identifying local flora and fauna, this sort of thing, things that a Native American would know in those lands more than the newcomers. Very practical. Now, the presence of a woman and her baby son would have provided reassurance to certain indigenous cultures, as she significantly contributed to diplomatic relationships by engaging with chiefs, alleviating tensions and conveying the semblance of a peaceful endeavor. Now, Meriwether Lewis' writings conveyed a fairly unfavorable perspective of her, although Clark held her in greater esteem and offered assistance to her children in later years. Now, in the journals, the terms of squaw or savages were employed to describe Sacagawea and other indigenous peoples, so it definitely was not a friendly dynamic between them. Of course, it wasn't just Sacagawea who was along for the ride too. There was a African man named York who was enslaved, but who participated in the voyage as the personal servant as his enslaver, William Clark. York significantly contributed to the expedition's success too, and they weren't trying to hide that he did it. He garnered popularity among the Native Americans, who had never encountered a man who looked like him. He also assisted with hunting and the arduous task of towing boats upstream. Notwithstanding his efforts to the core of discovery, Clark declined to give him his freedom upon returning east, which is not very nice of him at all. While all the other explorers reaped perks of twofold compensation and extensive land grants, York was the only one who got nothing in return, dragging all those boats for nothing. Following the conclusion of the mission, Clark permitted York a short visit to Kentucky to see his wife before compelling him to return to Missouri. It is improbable that he ever reunited with his wife. 10 years post-expedition, York remained a slave, laboring as a wagoner for Clark. Of course, the final years of his life were a little contentious. In the 1830s, there was a man of African descent who claimed to have accompanied the Lewis and Clark expedition, who was residing as a chief among the Native Americans encountered during a trip in present-day Wyoming. But this is not really confirmed. Well, as for Lewis and Clark, upon returning from their trip, they encountered difficulties in preparing their writings for publishing. Clark successfully convinced Nicholas Biddle to edit the journals, which were subsequently published in 1814 as The History of the Expedition under the Commands of Captains Lewis and Clark. Not a very catchy name. Now, Biddle's narrative account, however, excluded significant material pertaining to their discoveries in flora and animals. Biddle's narrative was the sole published record of the original journals for the subsequent 90 years, resulting in many of Lewis and Clark's findings being inadvertently rediscovered and renamed. Of course, the general public became aware of the comprehensive scientific discoveries made by Lewis and Clark only after the publication of the original journals of Lewis and Clark expedition by Reuben Gold Thwaites in 1904 to 1905. In fact, in the 19th century, mentions of Lewis and Clark were hard to find in historical texts, even during the United States Centennial in 1876, resulting in the trip being mostly overlooked. Lewis and Clark, beginning to attract attention at the onset of the 20th century, were mentioned a little bit more. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. Bit of an interesting trip back into the early history of the United States. Only a few decades after they were united. Well, united as much as they could be back then. Let's see how united they'll be in a few months' time. Best of luck to all of you with that unpleasant situation. Well, I'd like to thank my top tier patrons and supporters, whether they're on YouTube or Patreon. That's Dark, Carey, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizabo, Legitmus, Maverick, and Susan. Thank you all so much. You know I appreciate every one of you. And I appreciate you too, just for listening all this way. I hope you learned something. I know I did. Like I said at the start of the video, I never really learned too much about American history. Because I'm not American. So we don't really learn too much about that. Australian history, we learned about it in school, but you learn a lot more when you take it upon yourself to just do the research. They'll only teach you a surface level understanding in schools. Schools only really exist to have you just smart enough to run the machines and just dumb enough to not ask any more questions about it. So make sure that your education continues after you leave, because that bell doesn't mean that the learning is over. Anyway, good to see you all again, and as always, lots of love to each and every one of you. Have a good rest. See you in the next video.